welcome to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, and I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. It has been 7 years now that BorderReport.com was created to share local stories about people living, working, and migrating along the 2,000 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border. And it was nearly a year ago that we expanded our coverage with this streaming program, Border Report Live, that airs on Nexstar stations across the country. And all along, our correspondents in San Diego, El Paso, and right here in the Rio Grande Valley have been sharing the stories that they've been covering. There's the three of them right now. So today we are looking at some of the biggest events that Salvador Rivera, Julian, Resendiz, and Sandra Sanchez have been covering since 2019. And we're going to start today's program by bringing in our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, Rudy. Thank you. How are you, my friend? We rarely talk these days, or at least it seems that way.
Yeah, it's always all business here whenever we get to talk. But, you know, speaking of business, you've been part of the teams for a very long time now. Share some of the stories with the folks at home that you think have been the most impactful during your time with BorderReport.com.
Well, I came on 2020, early 2020, right as the COVID-19 pandemic was beginning, and we were rethinking our lives, rethinking how we did things, and everything seemed to go up in the air, and civilization as we knew it sort of ended. Of course, this was during the first Trump administration. I remember that he initially started getting money, investing it in building a border infrastructure. And this border wall construction began here in San Diego, and then it expanded outward towards the east. Here in the San Diego sector between San Diego and Tijuana, these 30-foot barriers went up. In many places, there was just not one, but two, and they ran parallel all the way from the ocean to the foothills of the mountains east of San Diego for about 60 miles. And these barriers immediately became very expensive, but also very controversial. We started hearing stories about migrants who were trying to climb over the structures, falling, injuring themselves, and in many instances, dying. A lot of ER surgeons, doctors, hospitals, trauma centers immediately came out and said, this is not right. A lot of people are getting injured and again dying. The Mexican consulate also came out and expressed this displeasure with the walls and hoping that something be done. But of course, the Trump administration never heard those comments, didn't care, and kept on going, building these structures up and down the southern border. Now, at the time when this was happening, we started seeing the advent of what's called Title 42. You might remember that. This was a public health law that was passed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention way back when. And this was instituted originally to prevent the spread of diseases across our borders or reaching our shores. And President Trump used this to keep migrants out of the U.S. The minute they crossed the border, were apprehended, they were sent back without a chance to seek asylum. Again, this was a measure to keep migrants, especially asylum seekers, from entering the United States. After President Trump left office, President Biden came in, and it took some time, but he eventually did away with Title 42 and stopped the construction of border walls. When Title 42 went away, this was sometime in 2023, he instituted, if you might remember, the CBP One app. But before that CBP One app came into vogue, a lot of migrants were coming here to seek asylum. And when he realized that he was about to lose the election in 2025 because of what he was, actually 2024, because of what he was doing, because of all the migrants that were streaming across the border at places like Acamba Hot Springs. These images were taken there a few years ago because there were a few gaps in the fence and people would walk across and stream into the U.S. Tens of thousands of people on a daily basis. There you see migrants who were cutting down shrubs and trees to build fires to stay warm in those winter months, because Acamba is about 60 miles from San Diego up in the mountains. We saw a lot of Asian, Chinese immigrants, people from all across the world stream into the U.S. in places like Acamba and other areas here between San Diego and Tijuana. Eventually, when Joe Biden realized that this was going to cost him the election or in danger of hurting his chances of becoming president again, he did away with Title 42, instituted CBP1, and said anybody who wants to come to the U.S. must get online and get an appointment through CBP1, and then get an appointment to enter the U.S. for a credible fear interview. If you were deemed that you had a real cause to seek asylum in the U.S., you would be allowed to stay in the country while your legal case went through. That, of course, that was no guarantee that they were going to get asylum, because most of the cases, 80% or so, were being turned away. So, Rudy, this is what happened leading into the end of President Biden's term. And then, of course, President Trump again came on to the White House, and he has been instituting new policies. He immediately did away with with CBP1, creating an almost making it impossible to seek asylum here in the U.S.
Now, we've covered a lot of things other than immigration here on Border Report Live and borderreport.com. And one of the things that you've covered very extensively is the Tijuana River Valley and the ecological impacts of what Mexico is doing south of the border. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, Rudy, this has been described as the environmental disaster of our lifetime. People here between Tijuana and San Diego seem to care more about what's going on there with the pollution than perhaps with the migration problems that we might have, or the perceived problems that we have because of the migration into the U.S. But this has been going on for decades and has gotten really bad in recent years. Beaches, the coastline remain closed in southern Imperial Beach, which is the first city north of the border. Its beaches have been shut down for more than 1,200 consecutive days. And even walking on the sand is a problem, because a lot of the sewage gets into the water, and all this bacteria remains in the water, and of course contaminates the sand as well. Surfers are asked not to go in the water, but if you know this surfing people, the breed, they don't care. They rather catch a good wave than they can get sick. But the sewage continues to flow to this day. It's not just sewage, but chemicals, trash, and other pollutants that flow from Mexico onto the U.S. side of the border, and eventually through the Tijuana River Valley, which is north of the border, and out to sea. And now we're finding out that when the raw sewage gets to the ocean, or as it cascades along the river, it is releasing all these gases that are creating health problems for residents along the Tijuana River Valley, including hydrogen sulfide, which is incredibly dangerous when you're exposed to it in frequent days. And that is exactly what's going on here. So now we're seeing a lot of money being poured in to try to fix this problem. But unfortunately, most of the money is being spent on the International Wastewater Treatment Plant, which gets the raw sewage from Mexico directly from a plant south of the border. But the water that you see here comes in via the Tijuana River, which does not get anywhere near this treatment plant. So the treatment plant might be expanded, remodeled, and will do a lot of good work, but nothing will happen unless we take care of the water that comes in via the river. So that is another point of contention for a lot of environmentalists and a lot of us who live near the border. We're saying, Rudy, it will be great if you fix the problem in that area with the treatment plant, but what happens to the ongoing flowing of this pollution that's streaming in from Mexico on a daily basis? And when it rains, Rudy, it's even worse.
Yeah, I know we've talked about the smell that, I can imagine just how bad that must be for it to be labeled by so many different people as one of the greatest ecological disasters of our lifetime. Staying on the topic of Tijuana, you've covered the shelters on the other side of the border. Tell us just really quickly a little bit about your coverage during your time on borderreport.com.
Sure. So after 2020, we started seeing the migrants being sent back because of Title 42. That created a big congestions, a lot of people going into shelters south of the border, while migrants kept coming to the border, hoping to get across that border into the U.S. In recent times, then let me get back up a little bit. 2023, 2024, just incredibly high numbers of people that were coming here because their goal was to cross the border and seek asylum. At the time, because of the way the asylum laws were written, people were able to cross the border and ask for asylum. People sort of found a loophole and were able to use this to their advantage. A lot of people came to Tijuana, and the shelters became just absolutely packed. Of course, in recent years, for the better part of last year, those numbers have gone incredibly down because now asylum is almost impossible in the U.S. So people aren't coming to the U.S. as much. Yes, we saw people being deported, but most of those people went to a special shelter that was set up by the federal government and the state of Baja California in Tijuana. But shelters themselves, private shelters, right now are fairly empty and certainly not what they were seeing in 2023, 2024 at the height of the migration to the border.
All right. We've been speaking with our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera. Always a pleasure to have a conversation with you, Sal. Appreciate you being here today.
Thank you, Rudy.
Stay with us when we come back. Julian Resendiz in El Paso going to go through some of the things that he's seen over the last 7 years on BorderReport.com. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Can you hear me, Julian?
I can hear you, Sal.
So it looks like they went off the air. I thought I saw Rudy.
And sorry about that technical difficulty. We are back here on Border Report Live, continuing on our tour across the border. We just finished with Salvador Rivera in San Diego. Time to bring in now Julian Resendiz in El Paso to talk about continuation, really, of a show we did earlier this week, some of the most impactful things that you've covered on your time here on BorderReport.com. Julian, fill us in.
Well, Rudy, I'm going to take us to today, here and now, and follow up on what Sal Rivera just told us. The images he showed of a multitude of people coming in at various points of the border. That's pretty much what we saw when we started Border Report. Now, I want to move forward to today. What we're seeing now that asylum has practically been stopped is we see an effort to go pursue the migrants who were already in the country. And what this is doing is it's filling up detention centers like the one here you see on the screen, Camp East Montana, in Fort Bliss, just outside El Paso, Texas. And that has brought a multitude of issues that lawmakers, activists, and even some federal officials are talking about today, and that is the great number of resources needed to run those centers. As a result, the one here in El Paso has been allegedly experiencing several issues, including 3 fatalities in a few months. And now recently, one of the area's Congress people, Gabe Vasquez, who represents Southern New Mexico, just across the state line, he toured this detention center just a few days ago, and we have some sound of what he had to say about this.
The conditions that I saw inside the detention facility today, I believe, are beneath our American values. In speaking with nearly a dozen detainees inside the facility, it was clear to me that folks in this detention facility are scared of speaking out. They are scared of what may happen to them. They're scared of punishment from guards inside the facility if they were to speak out about the conditions that they have faced. We heard today about concerns regarding the withholding of medical care. They said you practically have to be on the ground dying, choking, before you receive medical care. With one detainee telling me that he's had his medicine taken away with no explanation.
Yeah, really. My colleague Sandra Sanchez has written extensively about the tremendous increase in detainees at ICE detention facilities and all the issues that they're bringing about.
And Julian, another thing that we actually had on the list to talk about earlier in the week, but we didn't get to, was a fire that you covered in Juarez at, I believe, was it a migrant shelter?
Well, really, one thing has to do with the other, and that is the tremendous number of people who approached the border starting in the fall of 2018, going through 2019, and including the pandemic, the years of the pandemic, the year of the pandemic. That traffic just took local communities by surprise. I think this happened later all throughout the country and forced communities to deal with migration issues. But here in El Paso and in other border cities, as well as across the border in Mexican border cities like Juarez, like Tijuana, like Matamoros, officials also found themselves unprepared to deal with this massive influx of people. We had one case south of the border in Juarez in which so the alleged lack of training, the alleged lack of supervision led to a fatal fire in which 40 migrants, 40 human beings died, and 27 others were injured by smoke inhalation, by burns, by the aftermath of this fire. You're seeing some images of what happened there just a few years ago in Juarez, as some of the migrants were protesting inside a very large cell, wanting several things, such as to know the status of their cases, such as maybe food or water. And somebody lit a mattress on fire, and that led to an emergency situation in which the guards, amazingly, are seen on the video walking away as the migrants are engulfed by smoke and banging on the jail cell doors, pretty much pleading to be let out for their lives. This is just one example of how local communities were not prepared for this. Now, if we move on to the El Paso side, to the U.S. side, here in El Paso, it was mostly an issue of resources. And this became evident when CBP facilities were just so overcrowded that migrants who were seeking asylum began to be released with notices to appear in court at a later date. And in the meantime, CBP pretty much put them out on the street. And that forced the local community, local officials to huddle up and see what they could do. There were some emergency plans drawn up. Emergency reception centers were set in. The various branches of government coordinated and cooperated to take care of various aspects. The city, for example, took care of some of the feeding and some of the temporary housing. And the county of El Paso eventually took care of hooking up all these migrants who did not want to come to El Paso, but had to pass through El Paso to get to their destinations of choice. So again, you see those two examples that we covered of how local communities were not prepared for this increase in mass migration and how they struggled to deal with.
Again, thank you so much, Julian. As we mentioned earlier in the week, Julian, after today, will be moving on to some bigger and better things, working on a book that he has been wanting to work on for several years, among other things. And so once again, Julian, we'll see you again at the end of the program here real quick, but just wanted to say thank you so much for all the work you've done with us on borderreport.com.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Right. Stay with us. Border Report Live is back with Sandra Sanchez in just 2 minutes. And welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez joining me now to talk about some of the stories that she found to be most impactful during her time working with BorderReport.com so far. Sandra?
Hey, Rudy. Yeah, so before you came on board, I came on board July 1st, 2019. Julian had already been part of the team. I was the second one to join. And unlike my colleagues Sal and Julian, I'm actually not from the border. I'm from Washington, D.C., graduate from the American University. I think policy's in my blood from growing up in that part of the world. And so I love being here because I get to see how policy is enacted in D.C., but how it's actually implemented here on the border. And that's a lot of what I do with my stories. And one of the first stories was Remain in Mexico. This was the first Trump administration, August of 2019. I came upon this woman, Carolina Carranza, and her family. Now, that's Carolina. A few years later, there's a first picture, Rudy. There we go, August 2019. They were one of the first families to be sent back to Matamoros, not allowed to cross the Gateway International Bridge. And there they were living on the streets with other families that had gathered in what soon became a makeshift migrant camp that 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people lived in. I visited Carolina and her family 3-4 times a week at the time for several months. Her little girl, where you see she's got a diaper on, you know, there were some days that they couldn't change the diaper because they just didn't have supplies. And they didn't understand what happened. They came up from Guatemala, had no idea in the meantime that this policy had been implemented, and they were forced to wait there. They were also issuing numbers to cross the bridge. And, you know, her husband helped to watch the family because there was so much kidnapping and rapes of women. And they banded together as families that had just met one another and protected one another. And there were many nights they didn't sleep because they watched guard. And, you know, we actually followed Carolina. Now that other first picture you showed, she was able to legally cross, she and her entire family. They were given asylum and they had immigration court proceedings and an AI number, an alien identification number. I went to several of her court dates, and that's her outside her home near Houston, where she, you know, one day made the decision that she wasn't going to go back to court, and that's where we lost track of her, like so many other people have. And we actually ended up winning a Texas Headliner Showcase Award for Enterprise in 2021. We ran a series on her. You know, it was really an eye-opening piece for me. From other highlight moments, 2021, Del Rio, September 2021, I'm standing on the Del Rio International Bridge. There are an estimated 16,000 people below me, and I'm filming with a cell phone through the cracks in the bridge. And you see the Border Patrol. This is the famous Horse Patrol unit. I was there that day. I did not see anyone whip anyone. I've gone through all the footage that I had. I did see the agents hurting the migrants. There they are sleeping on the ground. They were yelling up at me, you know, send food, give me money. A lot of them were trying to cross the Rio Grande into Ciudad Acuña to get food because they've run out of supplies. Look, these banks of toilets were overflowed. You know, it was a catastrophe. I was on the bridge just for about 3-4 hours before they shut it down for 5 days. And then one of the scariest moments of my nearly 40-year career was trying to film, just take a picture outside McLaughlin Air Force Base, which is just about 20 miles outside Del Rio, and trying to get a photo of that and being actually pulled onto base, detained, not arrested, but detained under armed guards for a very scary several minutes, maybe even an hour, and told I'd be put in a transport unit. And luckily, the guard who had his rifle on me was from the Rio Grande Valley. We struck up a conversation, and he said, "Oh yeah, they're going to do He gave some number, 742 or something. I'm like, "What's that?" He's like, "Yeah, well, you won't be able to talk to anyone for so many days. They'll put you in a transport. They have the right to hold you." I was like, so I made some calls. I got out of there, but covering the border has had its scary moments, its frightening moments, its wow moments, and it's constantly evolving. We've seen from Operation Lone Star that hit Texas with Governor Abbott and the buoys put up. Now the federal government's putting their own version of river buoys up, National Guard, DPS troops. This is constantly evolving. I'm not going anywhere, and I continue to bring you the stories. So you and I will continue to chat about everything that's happening here.
And speaking of that, just wanted to say for one of the last times, I guess, as we get ready to wrap up here, for Salvador Rivera in San Diego, Julian Resendiz in El Paso, and Sandra Sanchez right here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley. My name is Rudy Mireles. See you next time.